I'm talking about ecological theology today. The title of my lecture is Burning Bush, Where is God Amidst Our Ecological Crisis? And hopefully by the end of the lecture, you'll have a sense of why I titled it that. So, just briefly, there's basically different disciplines here, the theological curriculum. I teach in systematic theology. Systematic theology, very briefly, is how all the different parts of Christian faith or teaching fit together. That's the idea of a system, right? A system is multiple parts fitting together. So how do all the various aspects of Christian teaching fit together? And how do we articulate that in our contemporary world? What does it mean to fit all the different pieces of Christian teaching together in a given context? So what does it mean to fit all the different parts of Christian teaching together in 21st century Australia, for instance? So one of the things that means is theology has got to address what's going on in the world. And one of the major things that's going on in the world is our ecological, what do you want to call it? Challenge, crisis, catastrophe, disaster, that I'm sure all of you are aware of, if not, have already been personally affected by. So here in Brisbane, right, we've had rain. We've had floods. A couple summers ago in Australia, we had fires. These are all effects of our changing world and the kind of blowback of human input into the world. So one of my jobs as a systematic theologian is to help Christians, to help the church, to help anyone interested think about what does the Christian faith mean in this context. So what I simply want to do in this little mini lecture in the next 15 minutes is just give you a very brief introduction to what ecological theology is. What kinds of questions does it ask, and what kinds of things, how does it ask us to rethink and reformulate, and again, re-put back together all the various pieces of the Christian faith. So I'm going to start with just a general sense of what is ecological thinking, because it's not just theologians and it's not just religious people, certainly, who think ecologically, right, and who are concerned about, there's ecological philosophy, there's ecological art, there's ecological whatever you want, right? And there's ecological theology. So what, in general, is ecological thinking? I find this a really helpful quote to get us into that by Virginia Burroughs. She herself is a Christian historian and theologian, and this is from her book, Ancient Christian Eco-Poetics, Cosmology, Saints, and Things. And this is how she defines ecological thinking. It entails attentiveness to the interconnection and the liveliness and agency of all beings. If some of us are just beginning to think this thought, this is because we are just beginning to comprehend the consequences of the failure to do so. Having believed ourselves masters of nature, we now learn the painful lessons of dependence and vulnerability. Ecological thought comes belatedly then. It arrives only when it is too late to undo the planetary damage. Yet thinking it matters more than ever. So just one thing to highlight from there is this notion of the interconnection and liveliness and agency of all beings. That this gets to the heart of what it means to think ecologically, is to think the interconnection of everything on the earth, and even beyond the earth. And what does it mean to rethink our human lives, not as though we were simply the center and masters of everything, but that we're one part of a vast interconnected web of beings. That really gets to the heart of ecological thinking and the notion of an ecology and of ecosystems, right? And it's really in some sense, our failure to do so that has in part led us to where we are today. And so it's really important to recover this sense of ecological thinking. So I think that's just a helpful kind of entry point into what does this word ecological mean. All right. I've got 3 theses for you I'm going to give you on the topic of Christianity and climate change. So again, this is just my kind of basic intro for you of how to get into the discourse of ecological theology. So, thesis number 1. It is unlikely that we will avoid a 4 degrees Celsius rise in average global surface temperature above the pre-industrial era by 2100. So, this is sort of where the science is today, measuring global rise in temperature, which is one of the big things affecting climate change, ecological disaster, is the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere raising the overall surface temperature of the Earth and creating all kinds of climate changes. So what we now know is it's probably unlikely that we're going to avoid a 4 degrees Celsius rise. And really that 4 degrees Celsius rise is kind of and again, depending on who you ask, but many scientists say that's the kind of point of no return, beyond which a kind of irreversible climate and planetary collapse will happen after a 4-degree rise in Celsius. And right now, in the way the world is going, and the way that we organize our economies, the way we organize our politics, the way we organize our consumption, it's looking unlikely that we're going to avoid a 4-degree Celsius rise. What would be required in order to avoid that would be a transformation of the entire energy basis of the entire global economy, from fossil fuels to sustainable alternatives, really within a period of 60 years from, say, 1992, which is when the Rio Earth Summit happened, when a bunch of people got together and said, if we're going to avoid climate catastrophe, we have to do this. And they set a 60-year goal to 2050 to say we have to reduce carbon emissions, we have to do this and this and this by 2050 to really avoid a kind of catastrophic solution. However, since the first 2 decades were the most important, really an important window period has already been missed. Now, I say this not to simply be doomsday catastrophic, but simply to be realistic about what the actual situation that we're living in. We're all probably to some degree alarmed about climate catastrophe, but we're all probably not alarmed enough. And so simply one of the main things that we have to get into this whole topic of ecological theology is really face honestly the disaster and face honestly the challenges. So for those sciencey people among you may have seen something like this. It's called the Kline curve, which basically measures the amount of CO2 that's been put in the atmosphere. This graph has from 1960, you see at the bottom left-hand corner, up to where we are now, about 2021, 2022. So the blue line represents the average. The up and down of the curve represents the seasonal changes of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so it does go up and it goes down, up and down all the time. But the general trend you can see is basically just skyrocketing upwards in terms of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. All right, that's thesis number 1. We're facing a big challenge, right? And this is the kind of evidence for that and what it would actually take. All right, thesis number 2. In order to prevent such a likely rise in average global surface temperature, a multidimensional approach would be required that would need to draw not only on science and technology, but would need to draw science and technology, economic analyses, political will, environmental education, and media coverage, but would also need to draw on, and here's where theology comes into play, and here's where us as people of faith, as spiritual people come into the conversation. It would also need to draw on cultural, moral, and spiritual traditions to transform the visions, goals, perceptions, hearts, minds, and habits and behavior of people across the world. So I think this is where we, as people of faith, and we're as Christians, and as people who represent the church, perhaps, are part of the conversation. Yes, there needs to be scientific, there needs to be political conversations, but perhaps even more fundamental, there needs to be spiritual, moral conversations about who are we as a human community, what goods do we value, what does it mean for us to be a collective human community, and to unite to face a big challenge like this. And I think the resources of spirituality to move us in that direction are what need to be talked about. All right, thesis number 3. In order to be persuasive in the long run, an ecological reformation of the Christian tradition. And this is part of what thesis 2 is suggesting, that what we need is a kind of ecological reformation of the Christian tradition to re-articulate, re-put back together the Christian faith in a way that would be relevant and matter and helpful for our world in crisis. So, in order to be persuasive in the long run, an ecological reformation of the Christian tradition cannot be approached only on a functional or pragmatic grounds, right? Just, well, how do we lower the CO2 in the atmosphere, and let's figure out the technology or whatever to do that, right? However important that conversation might be, that's not only what is needed. What is needed is that it would need to be deeply rooted in the symbols of the Christian traditions, in the core message of the gospel, the heart of the Christian faith in God as Trinity, an exegesis of the biblical text, liturgical renewal, and a retrieval of the virtues of faith, hope, love, and joy. So this right here, it kind of sets the agenda for what ecological theology might be doing. It sets itself the agenda of reinterpreting all of the central aspects of the Christian faith, from creation to salvation to even atonement to resurrection to really to church, to take any aspect of the Christian faith and ask the question, how do we re-articulate these symbols? How do we re-articulate the gospel message? How do we re-articulate the Christian doctrine of God, doctrine of Trinity in an ecological direction. And that's at the heart of what eco-theology is trying to do. So it's not just trying to, again, it doesn't just have this nice little corner over here, well, we should care about the environment or we should care about creation. Eco-theology has a much larger project for itself, which is how do we really, again, systematic theology, how do we take all the parts of Christian teaching and re-articulate them and re-put them back together in an ecologically aware way. So that's what eco-theology is. So, just an example of one stream of Christian theology that has been trying to do this for really the last 3 or 4 decades. One prominent stream of ecological thinking is eco-feminist theology. So eco-feminist theology, feminist there is in the title, so it's theology that takes into account the intersection not just of ecological concerns, but of ecological concerns with a whole host of other important issues facing human community and human oppression. So, and one of the things that eco-feminist theology is saying is that you can't really pay attention to ecological concerns unless you also pay attention to the interconnection of ecological concerns with all sorts of other problematic ways in which human beings have situated ourselves on this planet. So I've got a quote here from Rosemary Radford Ruether. Ruether was a Catholic theologian. She actually died just 2 weeks ago, I think. So I thought it was fitting to kind of give a little tribute to her here in this lecture. She's a pioneering Catholic feminist theologian. She wrote a really important book on eco-feminist theology called Gaia and God. And this is what she says. And again, this, for her, think about this in terms of how do we re-articulate some of the major symbols of the Christian faith to make them more helpful ecologically. She says, the way classical Western cultural traditions have constructed the idea of a male monotheistic God and the relation of this God to the cosmos as its creator have reinforced symbolically the relations of domination of men over women, masters over slaves, male ruling class over humans over other animals, and over the earth. So one of the things she's trying to say, and she's trying to connect the central, some of the central concerns of feminist theology, which is how the Christian tradition, and not only the Christian tradition, but a lot of religious traditions are deeply patriarchal. They center the voices and the power of men at the expense of women, and she's trying to connect that to the sorts of attitudes that problematically place human beings in relation to the earth. So the same sorts of problematic power dynamics that contribute to men being over women contribute also to human beings being over the earth. And she's saying you can't address one without the other. And at the heart of this for her is this notion of our picture of God. When our picture of God is one of a kind of male deity who rules over the earth and we must just submit to the all-powerful will of a male deity, which has been a key symbolic focus of the Christian faith, that has led to certain attitudes where we, human beings, in turn reflect that attitude towards the earth. So just as God, in a certain sense, rules over us, so human beings, in a sense, rule over the earth and can use it for our own purposes. Just as God commands human beings for God's own purposes, so we can command the earth for our own purposes. So she's trying to notice the connection between those two things and say we've got to rethink the whole thing and rethink our picture of God away from this kind of problematic picture of God to a different picture of God that makes God matter ecologically. So that's Ruether. Now the task of doing this, and a lot of eco-theologians say there's actually many, many resources within the Christian tradition. We can go all through the Christian tradition to take up Ruether's challenge and say, how do we reformulate our picture of God? How do we reformulate our picture of the earth and of other creatures? It's not to say that it's all been bad before this and now we just have to start over from complete scratch and create something new. No, Ruether and others would say we've got to mine the Christian tradition for all the ways in which it has all kinds of really helpful and provocative and interesting ways of thinking ecologically. So just as an example, I'm going to Hugh of St. Victor, who is a Saxon theologian, mystic in the 11th century. He's got a beautiful view of creation that includes not just human beings, but every single creature. And he comes from a tradition, and if you take my ecological theology class, which is this summer, I'm teaching it again, I'll go really deep into this tradition called the divine ideas tradition, which is basically that every creature in existence is a word of God. Every creature says something of God, and God put all creatures into existence in order to express something and represent something of God. So this is Hugh saying essentially that. So he says, for this whole sensible world is like a kind of book written by the finger of God. That is, created by divine strength. And each creature is like a kind of letter, not established by human convention, but instituted through divine judgment to demonstrate and in a kind of way signify the unseen wisdom of God. So his basic point is to view the entirety of creation as a book. And everything in creation is a letter within that book. And everything within creation is a letter that's forming words that's speaking to us of something about God. So how is it, so again, this is an attitude towards a kind of reverence towards creation. It doesn't place us as human beings as masters over creation. It places us as readers of it, right? So the metaphor of a book. We're to read creation. We're to receive something from creation about how all of creation is speaking to us of God. And again, just think that's a very different way of putting ourselves in relation to creation as recipients of something. God's speaking to us through all of creation, and therefore we ought to and can treat it with a kind of reverence. So again, that's just one small example of, from the 11th century, a kind of attitude towards creation that can help us think ecologically. Okay, last to end. Title of my lecture was Burning Bush, Where is God Amidst Our Ecological Crisis? I'm just going to end by giving you these three pictures, throwing them together and asking you to think about them. So, when you hear the phrase burning bush, what comes to mind?
Old Testament.
Okay, Old Testament, right? And what's the story in the Old Testament?
God appeared in a burning bush and spoke to Moses.
Yeah.
And,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. So here we go. I've just pulled this off the internet. Just Googled burning bush, right? And this is what came up. So, right, this famous story from Exodus when God addresses Moses out of the fire, right? And this is which is leading into the liberation of the people of Israel from bondage in Egypt, right? So God's speaking out of the fire, and it's, the paradox of a fire that the bush is not consumed in its burning, right? So, all right, what other evocations of burning bush might come to mind?
Bushfires.
Bushfires, hey. So, we got bushfires here, right? So, Australia, especially a couple of summers ago, we had catastrophic bushfires. So, bushfires, and this is, again, related to climate change, bushfires. And then the last picture I have up here is a picture of, what's sometimes called cultural burning practices of the Aboriginal people in Australia, of how one of the ways in which they care for and tend to and listen to the earth is they actually have controlled fires, burning back bushland to prevent larger catastrophic fires. So they, for a very, 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 very long time, have known how to use fire in a helpful way, right? Because fire is both immensely destructive, but fire is also life-giving. And the Aboriginal people of Australia have known how to harness and use this fire for a long time. So I'm just going to leave those three pictures with you and ask you to think about what are the connections between them, what are the tensions among them, how might they speak to each other, how might they grate against each other, and how might they lead us into some of what it might mean for us here in Australia to develop an ecological approach to theology. So, thank you very much.